Hi, I'm John Atack, and this is my guest, Rio Harada. And we are going to... What are we going to talk about today, Rio?
So, on your suggestion, I put some thoughts into Englishness as a concept, and generally just nationalism in the UK. And I thought it might just be worth maybe talking a bit about that.
I think it is worth talking about. I personally think it's a very important topic, especially given all of the swell around Brexit and the kind of anti-immigrant idea, and the place that you find yourself in, which is that you are by no means an immigrant. You're an English person.
Yes, that would be accurate. Before sort of getting the classic question of where are you from, which is from Nottinghamshire, born there, always lived there basically up until recently.
When you escaped to London.
Yeah, recently, and now I'm in London. I'm a first year undergraduate philosophy student. Though I did do a brief foray into music, but that's besides the point. I am half Japanese and half English. But to be honest, I probably identify a lot with my Englishness because I was brought up here. I didn't really necessarily sort of have one of those upbringings where, one parent only speaks one language and the other one speaks the other. Both my parents both speak pretty fluent English. My mum's, to her credit, a pretty excellent speaker of English.
She is, no doubt.
So and so I've had this sort of strange experience of always seeing myself as English, as being British, more accurately, but also always being seen by others as being distinctly non-English, non-British, being treated as such. So yeah, that's sort of where I'm coming from. And hopefully, I
mean, I had a good friend a few years ago, and both of his parents were African Caribbean. I think that's how it's said now. And he grew up here, and it was terrible that there'd be all sorts of racial slurs, all sorts of things said about him. And he was as English as English, this is where he grew up. You're a little bit exceptional in that you, alongside your English education, you actually attended Japanese school in England. Yes. And so you do speak Japanese, you've been to Japan, and you understand Japanese culture in a way that is unique, really, for an English person. But that still doesn't cross you over that borderline that you're being judged by your appearance. And let me just throw something in here that I've been writing about white supremacists, particularly about Dylan Roof, who went and shot 9 people. And it really got me into what their culture is. And these people call themselves neo-Nazis. And as a friend of mine, Yuval Law, points out, there are 2 things that agitate against that thought. The first is that a Nazi must have a Fuhrer, and they don't have one. And the second is that they think that being white makes them Aryan, whereas, of course, Hitler's main target was the Slavs. So if you have Polish ancestry or Hungarian ancestry, then you can't be a Nazi, I'm afraid. It's just a sad thought. But my point is that it makes the sense of identity very malleable. And the idea that, European people have been fighting with each other for thousands of years, and then they go to America and they become one people somehow. And it just doesn't work that way.
Well, yeah, it's this sort of idea that whiteness is an exclusive category, and it's expanded with time as we've got more sort of global. Because I mean, in America as well, it used to be that Italians and Irish people were considered non-white, and now obviously they're very much considered white. Which sort of
but anybody with Spanish descent is considered Latino.
Yeah. Though some Latinos now consider themselves white as well. So you get these sort of strange neo-Nazis in America who are Latinos, who were rejected by half of their sort of base and then sort of accepted by the other half. And it's obviously there is like a physiological connection, but it sort of really proves this sort of like it's like social definition of race, which we are working with at the moment.
And of course Hitler determined that Japanese were Aryans.
Yeah. And the Japanese had their own sort of insane racial hierarchy of their own, right? Which, I mean, how those were ever compatible, I will never see. But,
yeah,
and unfortunately, this is sort of where my Japanese heritage also tells you something interesting, which is that the Japanese themselves are race, and as a not as a race, but as a country, are very, very racist themselves.
You have the Ainu, that separate people who are sort of completely excluded and called hairy by other Japanese people. Then you have a caste system about butchers or rather the descendants of butchers. If you're a butcher in the 17th century, you're descended from a 17th century butcher, you're in trouble, basically.
And it's also just generally Japan's attitude, which is it's obviously got an aging population. As a country, it would much rather sort of fund government, I think they're crudely translated as breeding programs, where women are paid for having children, rather than just do the normal thing, which is just allow some immigration.
Yes.
And sort of attitude towards ethnic minorities in Japan is horrible. It's bad enough if you're a Japanese Korean, which were a product of the Japanese committing great atrocities. But if you're sort of, black or you sort of have a really difficult time in Japan. Though if you're white, you have a great time because we simply sort of idolize the white people, though they are still distinctly outsiders. Yeah.
Which, puts us in the, here you are in the reverse situation that, my perspective is very simple. We're all black. Some of us are just a lighter shade of black than the others. And that seems to be supported by genetics and by the archaeology of prehistory, that it would appear that the evidence is still pretty good that there are two races, the ones that stayed in Africa and the ones that left Africa.
Yeah.
And in fact, some of the ones that left Africa, they're still in Africa because they went back. They went, oh, it's not sunny enough in Europe, what have you. And all we're dealing with is skin pigmentation and certain facial features that are selected within cultures by what's called sexual selection, by the choice of partners, by what the culture thinks is beautiful. And that is very variable from one culture to another. If you look at what is considered handsome in an Inuit woman, or what is considered handsome in a Hottentot woman, and on and on and on, that these are preferences that build up culturally, and they will select for certain types.
And even temporarily, culturally over sort of hundreds of years in a given society, it changes. So there's no sort of like static, ideal human, which amongst all the other problems of eugenics is, the problem with it. Though it's back with a vengeance. And it's interesting you can talk about genetics because being pretty tech savvy from pretty early age, I've had the displeasure of talking to quite a lot of, frankly, white supremacists and fascists over the internet, and they all sort of use scientific racism as their sort of way of talking about it. What are they? They're race realists. That's what they call themselves these days.
Race realists.
And they draw upon very obscure tracts of sort of evolutionary biology that no one else understands apart from them, so they can sort of come off as legitimate and sort of say that they're different races, are different types. Yeah.
We've seen an incredible change in biology, which has happened within biology, and it hasn't really penetrated the world. We're still with the Mendel-Dawkins view of genes, which is frankly disproven. It's that simple. We now have what's called evolutionary development, or evo-devo. And it said that biologists under the age of 40 pretty much all accept now this far richer and more complex form. The simple difference would, the analogy that my friend Yuval Laor gives, it is that there's a presumption that genes are read-only, and that's the Mendel through Abbe Mendel through to Richard Dawkins. They're read-only, and the reality is that you can write on them. So, as a computer analogy, so all of this kind of the modules that developed on the savannah that Yuval Harari puts in his completely daft book, Sapiens, which has sold like 1 million copies. He's not a scientist. And modular theory, which again still powers much of sociology. People like Scott Atran are very interested in the religion module. You saw your ancestor saw a bush trembling and thought, oh, there must be a God. And that's now a part of your brain. It's like, yes, really. what we found is that evolution is happening moment by moment, that everything we do influences our genes. We have epigenetics, and we now have cultural transmission. We have this way of influencing things. So all of these arcane Aryan race theories are childish. And what's more, they've been, there's an interesting disproof earlier this year where they found a grave, a Viking grave, in which two people were buried with full Viking honors, but they're Sami, they're Laplanders, they're not pure Aryans. So the Vikings didn't have this stupid idea. If you could hit somebody over the head hard enough, then you could be a Viking, That was about the only, didn't matter what color your skin was. We also now know that there were Japanese people in South America centuries ago, just as there were Vikings in North America. We know that there's been a movement of culture and of people all over the world. And I'm going to use this word in the way that Barack Obama used it. We are all mongrels, all of us.
Yeah.
And what's more, we know that if you interbreed and interbreed and interbreed, you get a Cretin or a Habsburg or a Bourbon, or the royal family. No, we won't say anything about Prince Charles's ears, but you get the Habsburg chin, or you get these, you pass on porphyria in our royal family. So it is actually much better to have a broad range of breeding. The banana will probably go extinct in the next 100 years because all bananas are of one type. There's only one species, the Cavendish. It can be red, it can be yellow, it can be small, it can be big. But when a disease hits it, that'll be that gone. So, trying to breed down to keep your blue blood going, it's an absolute nonsense. It's a stupid idea.
Yeah. And also, all these ideas are sort of one question away from breaking. This is the classic one. What's always these days is IQ and race. Though obviously the entire central premise of that argument is completely bunk. You just have to actually look at the way they did IQ testing it's basic things like the test written in English and they couldn't read English. It's that is a shocking flaw in methodology. But even on that,
the exclusion of Jews from the United States after the Army Alpha test during World War I, because it determined the Jews weren't as intelligent as British and Scandinavian people, and the quotas for the British and Scandinavians were never met, but they wouldn't extend them to include Jews. Now, anybody that thinks of the Jews as being a stupid people is a stupid person. Einstein, for example, or half of the great classical musicians.
Yeah, Mendelssohn comes to mind immediately.
Yeah, whose tomb was desecrated and whose music was stopped by the Nazis. But many of our great virtuoso musicians, Zach Perlman immediately springs to mind. Ashkenazi, so many, Yehudi Menuhin, so many great musicians. Thinkers, Spinoza, one of the great philosophers.
Marx, I think, was technically as well. I think
Marx is, and it's one of the ideas put forward by white supremacists that communism was started by a lot of Jews. Trotsky was a Jew, and so on and so forth. And you go, yeah, well, they were kind of born into Jewish families, but they weren't actually practicing Jews at any point. And I also wrote a chapter for a book that I think is called Anti-Semitism and Psychiatry, or Psychiatry and Anti-Semitism. It was published earlier this year, but by Springer. And my concern, this was sort of, my friend Steve Hassan was very busy writing a book called The Cult of Trump, and he needed help to finish a chapter off, so I put the chapter together. But it was anti-Semitism, and it was what does this word actually mean? And I read Shlomo Sand's Invention of the Jewish People, and Shlomo is a friend of my friend Yuval Law, and he teaches at Tel Aviv University, where they actually have a separate department of Jewish history. Now he's in the history department, and nobody will talk to him in the Jewish history department, because he's saying, look, the reality is there is no Jewish people. There are people of all races, there are people of all types, and probably the majority of the people in Israel now have no descendants who came from there. And genetics is starting to say that the true Israelis, the true Judeans, actually never left there. There was no diaspora. It's a myth. And the people who stayed there converted to Islam. So the Palestinians are the people who are promised the Holy Land in the Bible, and they're not getting very much of it at the moment. but it did for me raise this question of what are the boundaries of race and culture. And if your ancestors came, as with some Jews, they come from the Yemen, some come from Africa, most of them probably come via Eastern Europe from the Khazar kingdom that converted to Judaism because it was a barrier state between Islam and Christianity, and it meant they could make a deal either way at any time, which is politically very sensible. But it meant there was suddenly a flood of Jewish people. You then look at the religion and say, well, if you have two rabbis in the room, you have three opinions. That's certainly my experience. I know it's considered racist to say this, but three or four of my closest friends happen to be Jewish, and each one of them, four of them in fact, has a radically different view of the world. My friend Yuval would say that he's only Jewish on his parents' side. He's never practiced Judaism. I don't think his parents have either, actually. But he grew up in Israel. Mm-hmm. My friend Ira Chalef grew up in New York, and he goes to Quaker meetings to get his spirituality. He just wants somewhere quiet, and will light some candles and what have you at the appropriate times of year. My friend Steve Hassan will go to temple at particular times, and that's a part of how he practices. But then when you get to which temple, and the conservative ones and the various, the Haredi and the so-called ultra-Orthodox, they don't like the term, then you get this other split, which is the pro-Zionists and the anti-Zionists. Many people don't realize that there's a huge proportion of Jews who are against the establishment of the state of Israel and the return to Zion or Jerusalem. So you get all of these things, and people want to collect everything together in a bag and say they're Jews. They've got the Zionist organized government, and they run Nazi or whatever pathetic nonsense is being handed out.
Well, it is that insane idea that Nazis had back then and still have now, which is that at the early 20th century, the Jewish population in Europe had anything close to a coherent worldview. It's absolutely insane. In fact, you could probably make quite a strong argument that the mid to late 19th century to the early 20th century was probably the point of most division between Jewish sects. And with people sort of denouncing their Jewishness, with people sort of liberal Jewish strains wanting Zionism, and then sort of Orthodox ones not wanting Zionism because of the roots of it ideologically. Get like anarchist Zionism, left Zionism. There's so many different views, and then the idea that they put together this text called the Protocols of
the Elders of Zion
is absolutely insane to me.
There's an amazing book by Norman Cohen called Warrant for Genocide, which deconstructs the story of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And it's one of those undeniable things, because the original of it still exists in a Swiss library and was published, I think, in the 1860s. And it doesn't mention the Jews or Zionism at all. When it's actually an attack upon Napoleon III in France. And the man, I think, was sent to prison for writing it. So it's a known text that the Cheka, the Russian secret service, the most efficient of all secret services, the Russians, as ever, they constructed this round about the year 1900 and just dropped in the word Zionist. It's like the Constitution of Iraq after the Allies were there. It's actually the Constitution of Germany, where they had to scribble out the word Deutschmark and write things in. I'm not kidding. That was the constitution that was given to the Iraqis after the occupation, or during the occupation, I should say. It's the first thing that was given to them. And it's the same with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's an absolute forgery. And the way that it's held up as if it had any meaning. I got into what is Zionism. The other book I read was Barbara Tuchman, The Bible and the Sword. And she points out that Zionism began in about 1621. And it was a notion of the English Puritans, because they read the book of Revelation where it says, Jesus won't come back until the Jews go back to Jerusalem and are converted. And the most horrifying story that I came across was about Ord Wingate. And there are a lot of horrifying stories, but So actually, it's wrong to judge them in order of horror. Orde Wingate was one of my childhood heroes because I was very much into war and fighting and that sort of stuff when I was 10 years old. And Wingate led the Chindits in Burma, who harassed the Japanese, and was apparently quite good at it. And as very few people were good at harassing the Japanese, he was elevated to a certain status. Then I find out that in the mid-1930s, he'd been sent to Palestine with orders to train the Jewish settlers in acts of terror against the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. And there are, all over Israel, there are places named Wingate Street. That's how they say it. So, in fact, the idea, he was a member of the exclusive, or of the Plymouth Brethren, one of the sects of the exclusive Brethren, who are ultra-Puritans. So he was imposing this from his own position and with the permission of the British government, with the idea of creating disruption in that part of the world. And they succeeded.
Beautifully succeeded.
Yeah. But in fact, Zionism only becomes a Jewish thing. It keeps being insisted upon the Jewish population. And, oh, no, we don't really feel like it. Thank you. Mm-hmm. It's only really in about the 1870s that anything that could be called Zionism comes along. And it's of no significance to the world whatsoever until the interwar period, where they start being trained in murderous terrorism. And it's not to say that the local Palestinians didn't, do things back to them, and the British Army certainly had just one of those three-cornered fights. But it was bound to lead to trouble, and it has led to a divided state where there is an underclass. There are Übermensch and Untermensch, as the Germans put it.
Yeah, and
despicable.
Yeah, and it's just generally as well that there's a very forgotten history of left-wing Zionism and of Jewish anarchists.
Yes.
Which were distinctly anti-racist and very much into proof those sort of measures. But it's this sort of relationship that sort of is the reason why you get these strange moments where Netanyahu will meet with Trump, and for some weird reason, like the sort of white supremacist base kind of likes Netanyahu, and Netanyahu kind of funds some of the organizations which form the pipeline to get to the point where you're watching Stefan Molyneux or something, and then veer off into some, I don't know, Richard Spencer sort of, Proud Boys sort of material. Yeah.
Or Jordan Peterson. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, God. Who gave one of the most pathetic attacks on Marxism I've ever seen in my entire life.
I think he's a transdimensional weasel, and I think David Icke should be writing about him instead. But
they should all start going at each other, because they almost are all too parodistic to sort of be. It's like the only way that Alex Jones would ever be involved in a conspiracy theory is if he was put out by the government to make people look away from the real things,
I've been working on this idea for a while, actually, that when QAnon came out, it was at first thought to be a 4chan hoax. It would appear now that it's an aspect of defecting members of the National Security Agency. So it may be rather more serious than we thought. But this idea that you can bring together people who have adopted flat earthism, anti-vaxxing, chemtrails, you can bring them all together in this one place. And surely the thing is to say, well, this is actually a Russian intelligence operation. David Icke, in fact, is a Russian, and he's Jewish, and he's black, and he never was the goalkeeper for Ipswich City or whatever they're called, football club. And nobody who wears a shell suit should be listened to. It's pretty simple. And I like the point where he said that the transdimensional lizards, accusing the royal family of being transdimensional lizards, had come to him when he had taken ayahuasca, which is about the most significant hallucinogen ever discovered, way beyond LSD or anything like that. And he's going, oh, yeah, I was tripping, man, sorry. And you go, well, where do you get your other insights from?
Yeah. Well, it's like all the shows that of Alex Jones going on the Joe Rogan show. Half the time he's smoking weed, at least, and I'm pretty sure they're doing something harder than that every single time. So they're very open sort of drug users, quite a lot of them, and that's how they get lots of their ideas.
Yes, And don't knock it. Creativity often comes from the use of drugs.
Well, no, yeah, true. Lots
and
of great...
sadly lead to hallucination as well, I'm told, you know.
Yeah, well, because I mean, it would only take sort of like a base level of even in-group preference to eventually snowball out of control to develop views like these. It's like what, you know, because I mean, lots of racism these days, at least on sort of a societal level, isn't you know, hate crimes or people shouting things in the street, but that still does occasionally happen. It's more sort of things like you'll go into a supermarket, you'll be queuing up at the till, the person's having a perfectly nice conversation with the person in front of you. You come along and they say hello, and then there's no conversation whatsoever. They don't even ask you how your day is, because there's sort of this recognition that you're another. We have to stop talking to you now, which isn't something. It's quite hard to, you know, study something like that necessarily, and obviously, you know, and for various reasons, you know, it could just be that, you know, I'm a particularly unlikable person at the supermarket, you know.
Maybe you smell.
Yeah, possibly.
Well, I must say I've never noticed it in the 18 years I've known you, but there you go.
So, but yeah, there's this sort of very frustrating feeling that, you know, I identify in the same way as you, and yet you treat me differently, and you exclude me from certain sort of social interactions. And if you just take that sort of base code and you take a lot of drugs, have an incredible doubt of the government, I can see how you know, eventually get to views that they hold.
I think there's also a thing that there's a difference between an argument that makes sense and an argument that has evidence to support it. And I think we're seeing things that if this is true, then this can be true. Now, see, one of the things in the Trump campaign that I didn't understand, and that is his daughter is Jewish. Let's face this. So why are the white supremacists so keen on this man? Because if he carried on, pretty evidently in his world, the next president would be Ivanka, and she's Jewish. So they've become very confused, I think, about what it is they believe by trying to draw these hard lines, by trying to suggest that, you know, and what about Farage? Is that an English name? You know,
it's the son of immigrants, I believe. Yeah.
And the same is true, say, with Michael Portillo, or Portillo, if you prefer. His father was Spanish. Helena Bonham Carter, and you can't get more English than that. Her grandparents were Spanish. What are we allowed to do and not allowed to do? That you know, who could be more English than Michael Portillo or Helena Bonham Carter? But they aren't.
That's how they draw those. You see those massive pictures of like lots of these are all the Jewish owners of media companies, and it's like, yeah, that they all do have Jewish blood at some point in the last 150 years. Well done. You said nothing meaningful about the world, you know.
No, as if there was some kind of mycelium of Jewishness that connected everybody together, and
like the really, Jew gene that sort of drives you to destroy the white race or something, which is completely insane.
Well, I think if you look at the subtext in the Marx Brothers movies, you'll find that they were, in fact, you know, undeniably destroying whiteness.
They were promoting race mixes completely. Yeah, you know, it's telling your it's just very strange relationships they all have with it. So it's this whole like Jeffrey Epstein thing as well. You know, it was bang on at the Clintons about it. Though it sort of died down a little bit because there's so many pictures of Trump hanging out with him, you know?
Yep.
And Jeffrey Epstein's ring of contacts seems to be the closest thing to what QAnon describes initially, and yet there's a complete denial that Trump has any involvement with it. And in fact, he's the one who's fighting them in the deep state, like some sort of, you know, I think some people call them the Great White Hope, you know, to deal with this. It's completely unhinged.
Well, Great White Whale. It is. It's the idea that, you know, the billionaires are running the world, so the best thing to do is to put one of them in power. And then we find out he isn't even a billionaire. He doesn't earn any money at all. He's a pathetic businessman.
Yeah.
When reading the dangerous case of Donald Trump, the 37 mental health professionals who under Bandy Lee decided they'd better assess this guy. And you know, Tony Schwartz is in there, who wrote The Art of the Deal for Trump, and he says this thing that Trump views. He was taught by his father, Fred Trump, that you're either a predator or you're prey in the world. And I think that is the usual idea that psychopaths have, that there's just that choice. To be not a predator and to be not prey is not, imaginable in their universe. I mean, I have a book called Pimpology, written by a pimp, which is completely unreadable. But he explains that in this world there are pimps and hoes. These simple, this predatory view of the world, and the idea that you're going to drain the swamp. The swamp is plutocracy. The swamp is the influence of the super rich. And basically the thing is to grab hold of George Soros and Bill Gates, all of these people, and shoot them.
Yeah,
Lenin had the right idea about that.
Yeah, you have a vote, it didn't go your way, well, send in a guard, shoot all of them.
Definitely. The anti-Bolshevik activity, which was first detected by Mao, in fact, and Stalin learned this from him. Mao at one point, and he wasn't leader until well on, but Mao at one point actually took his troops and killed 1 in 4 of them for anti-Bolshevik activities. So if he can do that, why can't we just take the super rich and say, look, anybody that's got more than 100 million, you shouldn't have it. So you either give us the money or we shoot you. It's a simple political notion. Or we tell you what, worse than shooting you, we make you watch David Icke videos all day and every day.
There is this strange relation between the economic policy and the sort of racial policy that you get with these groups, because you do get this sort of like, we're protecting the American homeland sort of talk from someone like Trump. And you look at the sort of economic policies institutes, it's tax cuts for the richest. I think it probably links a bit back to the roots of modern neoliberalism and the sort of end of history narrative that was really trotted out in the 90s. Which is, if you look at Margaret Thatcher, who was one of those people who's supposed to bring the end of history about in the UK, for example, her actual social policy is quite racist, quite anti-immigrant, very anti-homosexual. Obviously, was it section... The number evades me, but the one that said you can't promote homosexuality in schools, which is essentially used to promote homophobia in schools.
Yes.
She said things about how the British nature had something, has done so much for democracy and law, and that we're worried that it might get swamped and our culture might be perverted. It's very classic.
We might not be allowed to commit genocide against the Tasmanians again in the truly British manner. And what's more, she's of course buying a myth created by Winston Churchill, who, forgive me, was half American, but was voted the greatest Englishman, the greatest British person ever in 1999 by popular approval. And, for me, the jury's still out on that man, who did create a mythical golden age, this sceptred isle and set in an emerald sea and all that. Shakespeare, wasn't it? But he cites that kind of idea of this ideal golden age place, that Trump, of course, would plug into making America great. And we're going, when do you mean? When was it great? During the period of slavery? Or,
was Britain great when we were sort of going around the world, essentially pioneering lots of the worst forms of torture that we see later on?
So to be fair, it was the Spanish Inquisition who first used waterboarding, and to be accurate, what they did at Guantanamo Bay was not waterboarding, because waterboarding, you wet a towel, where they were actually pouring water straight into the lungs of the victims at Guantanamo Bay. And it's one of the great outrages for me that Barack Obama, given the chance to get rid of the people that had done that, decided not to do it. He didn't want to upset the Republicans.
Well, that's also sort of the weird reason. This is the other strange thing about this new right. They're very anti-interventionist. They're very anti-Guantanamo Bay. They're very pro-Assange. They're very pro people like Snowden.
Yeah, I'm very pro-Snowden too.
I'm very pro-Snowden. I think, Assange, Snowden are very important.
Yeah.
At least very important, if not, an essential figures.
It's like Ellsberg and the Vietnam papers that came out, that these individuals are so important that every now and then we need to be reminded that the people who have power are not ethical. When Barack Obama said, well, of course we're bugging the phones of leaders of other countries, of our friends, just to make sure they're not having any, dangerous conversations. That was the mask moved at that point. And
yeah, well, it's the whole sort of Russians are interfering with our election, as if they'd never interfered with anyone's elections. Yeltsin was put there in the first place by the Americans.
And we hear about APT 10 in China and APT 28 and Fancy Bear, what have you, in Russia, but no confession about what America's been doing. And one example, something that certainly wasn't in my history lessons at school, we know that the SS regiments from Belarus and the Ukraine were exported. Belarus to the US with fake papers, and the Ukraine here. And they were SS regiments. Mm-hmm. They were local recruits who were members of the Nazi party and fervently wanted to kill Jews and anybody that got in the way. What is not so much talked about is that Belarusian SS were then parachuted into the Soviet Union during the late 40s and 50s to commit acts of sabotage. This isn't a Cold War. This was, but we're not going to talk about that. And I have this very strong feeling that until we actually have ethical governments, mm-hmm. then we won't actually have an ethical society, that things will go badly wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I actually have tried to think of what politicians in the past were, which among them were ethical. And it's a very hard question.
Very short list.
Yeah.
Very short list.
Neville Chamberlain's the only one I've found so far, actually.
Yeah. Ironically,
they did all the right things, and
everyone hates him for it.
Yeah. No, the funny thing is that he was vilified in a book called The Guilty Men the year after he died, which was co-authored by Michael Foot, who would later become leader of the Labour Party. And they sort of say, well, look, he should have stopped Germany. You go, look, hang on a minute. In 1935, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer and he put forward a budget of rearmament, the whole Labour Party voted against him. So what are you talking about? When, Winston Churchill said we should get bomber aircraft, Chamberlain went, no, we need fighters. And if he hadn't done that, the Battle of Britain would have been lost. And if he entered the war in 1938, there were 12 operational high-altitude fighter planes in Britain at that time, Hawker Hurricanes. We would have been wiped out. So he did everything right.
Germany's military technology as well was staggering. The History Channel loves to bang on about how good the tanks were in, Nazi Germany, as well. They go, well, if we ignore the Holocaust, which is a very dubious statement, but never mind.
They still lost the Battle of Kursk to the Russians, though, the greatest tank battle ever. So, mm-hmm. Though the Russians were primitive, they could build things with very thick metal walls,
Yeah. And very impressive.
They did beat them. The jet technology, particularly with the Germans, and had they pursued the atomic policy, the world would probably be a very different place today. But
although Michael Foot brings up this other weird road of sort of anti-immigrant thinking, which comes from the left. Yeah, which is growing more powerful, I'd say now, actually. Which sort
National socialism.
Yeah, exactly. It's the SDP sort of route where, unfortunately, figures I quite like Tony Benn, and the strong opposition to Iraq War, and then you get from that people like George Galloway.
Yeah, and
George Galloway has completely gone and become the sort of if we're standing for the workers, we can't stand for minorities, we can't stand for women. The sort of common man approach, which is about essentially excluding, it's this return to communities, and they're sort of drawing upon this sort of like view that Thatcherism and neoliberalism in the 90s gave birth to the big metropolises we have now. This is actually the few things I wrote down before we started. Started talking. So, which is I feel like what happened in correct me if I'm wrong. This is just me putting ideas out.
It's all right. People will attack us in the comments section. Don't worry.
Yeah. So I feel like neoliberalism in the 90s and the 80s and 90s, what it created essentially was like two Englands, where you didn't attack the social component, right? So you still said it's okay to hate immigrants. covertly. It's okay to dislike homosexuals. It's okay to have sexist, backwards views. And this sort of flowed quite well in communities and sort of local communities. And then also the sort of incredibly laissez-faire economics allowed for big industries and companies to basically suck all of the jobs around from surrounding areas and just centralize them to massive metropolises. And so you sort of get these views of like two Englands. You get like London and the countryside.
Yeah.
London and the rest almost at this point. And so all of culture, so to be an artist or a musician or a poet or a writer these days, you have to be based in one of the big metropolises now.
Yeah.
And there's this sort of nostalgia in these old areas now for old England, and that's the sort of banner of this sort of socially conservative, but economically not even. I mean, left wing is too generous. I mean, economically backwards, frankly. You know, sort of classic socialist view that unfortunately even Jeremy Corbyn subscribed to, which I mean, while I liked Corbyn in some ways, his economic policy was still a sort of a relic of the last 100 years.
It's authoritarian. The left are authoritarians who want everything to be owned by the state, and the right are authoritarians who want everything to be owned by the rich. And then somewhere you've got those of us who believe in social capitalism, where everything should be owned by the people, which is not communism. It's not a state control.
Yeah,
where the rights actually go from the bottom up rather than the top down.
Yeah.
Godwin, one of the founders of anarchy and the father of the mother of Frankenstein's monster. So in the late 18th century, he says, what's the law for? It's to protect the property of the rich. And when you start looking at the whole legal construction in which we are trapped, it is very much still protecting the property of the rich. I was amazed. A wonderful history program, David Olusaga, I think the guy is called, and he looked at the repeal of slavery, so that finally in 1834 it was ruled that not only couldn't you sell people, but you couldn't breed them either, which is what the slaveholders were now doing. And the slaves had to be manumitted, they had to be released. In 1838, the biggest compensation payment ever made by the British government was made to the slave owners. The slaves got nothing. And you find some, widow of a vicar in Wakefield who owned half a slave in Trinidad and Tobago and got compensation for that.
And you get these strange sort of, and there's weirdly some people who celebrate that, so which I completely fail to understand.
And what continues is that the descendants of the people who ran that particular criminal activity are still the richest and most powerful people in our society. And that continuation of inheritance absolutely floors me. The idea that you can be born with absolutely no merit in the world. Your dad might be Oliver Cromwell, who was a genocidal maniac, by the way, but quite good at keeping it together. But you're Richard Cromwell, and you're no good at it. There is this idea of blue blood has now become some kind of, intelligence is genetically inherited. Now, nobody thus far has got anywhere near proving that point.
Yeah. And there's also something weirdly, like even with Cromwell and feudal religion, that's strangely almost somehow that's actually weirdly more accountable in some ways. Because if you're really horrible, really, really horrible, you will get overthrown. If you're a really horrible businessman, you won't get overthrown.
No, you just put your money in another country and don't pay taxes.
Put them in the Cayman Islands or something, right? It's where, I mean, because personally my politics probably lie, mostly I probably self-describe as an anarchist in the way I view the world. Left wing, not one of those sort of Rothbard sort of Mises Institute types.
A pacifist anarchist, not and I'm in the same place. If it were possible, then
the issue
Marx,
is,
of course, believed that anarchy was the final state. But you have to, the thing I've banged on about for decades now is you have to be able to isolate the human predators. You have to take the predators and put them to one side. You don't have to actually put them up against the wall. I don't really mean that, but you do have to depower them, defang them, so that you don't have people who are evidently malevolent having power over the rest of us. There should be no birthright to power in a democracy.
Well, firstly, you should just not have an economic system that rewards being a predator. Like, I think that's like a really basic step. And also, we shouldn't have an economic system that also allows you to transform your your capital into social capital. That allows you to basically take the millions you've earned and then use it essentially as political capital. Because one of the biggest misunderstandings about democracy is there's a view that we have equal political power in our system because we all have a vote.
Yeah.
This is but if you think about democracy carefully, the vote actually is more like a test to see where everyone's at that point in time. The real politics of democracy happen in the debate stage. The real politics of democracy are before the vote.
Yeah.
And in that sphere, there are certain voices with more influence. Now, you can say on an individual level, you'll find some views more compelling than other ones, and that's clearly true. But if you have an advertising campaign that says, even if it has 10% success, even if it just convinces 12 people, that's still 12 more votes that you have in reality than another person who doesn't have that sort of capital and free time to convince people.
You're only looking to the floating voters. So the awful story after the Iraq War, the next Labour election, which I think was 2003, their focus groups, which are largely 35-year-old housewives. These are the people. They're not fixed with the Tory party, fixed with Lib Dems, or fixed. They might change their mind. What was most bothering them? And what was most bothering them was that people were leaving their bins out, their trash bins, on the street. And so in a week, they rushed in a law that said that you couldn't put your bin on the street before 7 o'clock in the morning, and you had to remove it by a certain time. It just so happens that my niece-in-law is an executive in the local council. She helps run things. So I went to her straight away and said, how applicable is this law? And she said, there is no council in Britain that will apply it. It was done solely and cynically to move that slight, with Brexit, the way that Aggregate IQ, Cambridge Analytica, Strategic Communications Laboratories, SCL, that I'm not sure how much effect they had on the Trump campaign, frankly. But I think with Brexit, they tipped the balance by getting people to vote who wouldn't vote. They also use a campaign which Trinidad and Tobago again, second time. They ran a campaign there where it was Indian descendants, African descendants, and their campaign was to stop black kids from voting, young black voters, and their whole campaign went into stopping this. And they got people actually out on the street saying, don't vote, don't vote. And what they figured was that the Indian kids would all join in with the don't vote movement, but then they'd do what their parents told them, whereas the black kids wouldn't. And they won. And it meant that everything shifted. And they knew it. They knew cynically that whichever party got in would favor its own people, rather than, where we've got to go if we are to survive as human beings is to favor humanity.
But they do this while maintaining, and this is the thing that I just don't understand, while maintaining incredibly free reign for corporations, incredibly free reign for oil tycoons, incredibly free reign for many people.
Clean coal. Has he ever seen a piece of coal? It's not clean.
It's also it's just cognitive dissonance in 2 words.
Yes,
and it just sells it, and people buy it. And it's completely, I mean, Brexit as an entire policy is strange as well in that sense as well.
And it's left us in a ship of fools that the Jacob Rees-Mogg, Michael Gove, people who, they really have very little grasp of reality. That it took David Attenborough to persuade Michael Gove that dropping a shitload of plastic in the oceans is a bad idea. And the rest of us had worked this out decades ago.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious that, some poor octopus getting trapped in a net is not a good thing for the future of humanity. That if we poison the nest, that there won't be a future.
It's not even climate change. This stuff it's more basic than that.
Yeah,
it's just pollution.
The amount of mercury in our swordfish now is enough to scare the living daylights out of anybody, and it's such a delicious thing, swordfish. So it's a rotten idea.
Shame, yeah. So and then we overfish it, and fisheries. That was one of the most surreal political points Brexit has ever brought up. As if suddenly we were in, Britain was a country of millions and millions of fishermen.
Yes.
That were all being oppressed by Juncker specifically, coming over, snatching their nets out of their hands.
Yeah.
Though clearly, completely untrue.
And Nigel Farage was actually on the European Union Fisheries Commission forever, and so concerned about the fisheries that in something over 200 meetings, he bothered to attend 6 because he was busy undermining things. I mean, the European Union is corrupt and foolish.
Oh, yeah.
The whole premise of it should be renegotiated. But it's one of those things where you can hang together or hang separately. And I think we're headed into that place after Reaganomics, where the idea was, well, we use slave labor in the special economic zones of the Pacific Rim. And, people like Alan Sugar, or he's Lord Sugar now, isn't he? Given a lordship for actually deconstructing British manufacture and getting the Indonesians to make his little Amstrad computers. Mm-hmm. We live in Jonathan Swift is much missed. We could do with the Gulliver's Travels to explain the craziness of our current situation. We're always able to look back at the last generation and see how nuts they were. Yeah. But we've got it in real time. We've got Duterte in the Philippines saying, my only crime is the extrajudicial killings. Your only crime is mass murder. I'm having a problem. You didn't steal anything from an old lady's handbag. But, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, who's done more damage per square kilometre than possibly any other politician of the generation. Scott Morrison in Australia, Netanyahu, who we mentioned, Modi in the Indian right. We're in a terrible situation. As Lord Hailsham, who was a right-wing Tory, said, and very influential cabinet minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer, we live in an elective dictatorship. We don't live in a democracy. We elect our dictators for another term. And then you have the myth that you can control economics, the invisible hand of the market, which is, we've got Richard Dawkins going on about atheism. Well, what about the invisible hand,
Yeah, the biggest cult religion in the world.
It is. The free market economy has become, and it's entirely mythical. Nobody's ever done it. Everybody has, the subsidies and sanctions going on. The US, the reason that the Afghan economy cannot recover, and it is mentioned in the wonderful film War Machine with Ben Kingsley and Brad Pitt, which is hilariously funny and horribly true. It's put forward, well, why do they have to grow all these poppies? When the Taliban were in power in 2001, there was a deal with the British about the restriction of raw opium, and they exported 108 tons of raw opium. By 2004, where Britain is actually occupying Helmand, one of the chief production areas, there's 4,000 tons of opium exported. And it's like, well, why hasn't this changed? Oh, well, you see, they could grow cotton, but America has embargoed that. They can't, because they'd be competing with the subsidized cotton industry of cotton agriculture of the US. So free market. I think the other thing about Adam Smith, and this basic economics, is to point out that Adam Smith said you take all the rentiers, all the landlords, and shoot them.
Yeah, well, it's like killing landlords doesn't start with Mao; it starts with Adam Smith. Yeah, because Adam Smith saw them as a drain on entrepreneurship.
But Mao actually did it.
True. There was a difference in that sense.
7 million people died.
No, Adam Smith wasn't. Though, it'll be interesting to put Adam Smith in China at the time and see if he became a Maoist or not.
Well, I think the problem was that it went rather further than just killing off the rentier. That I've read a fair amount about the transition to power because I'm very interested in the thought reform camps, the re-education camps that ran from October 49, though already 200,000 people had been through the program by the time Mao takes over. And it's run till 1953. And they decide they don't need to do it anymore, though, of course, they've done it in Xinjiang and other places again since. they don't need to do it anymore, because now every student in college will actually attend the assassination, the torture and killing of people who are named enemies of the state, who've not necessarily done anything. It's, you know, the witch trials don't come close to what Mao did. He himself was very engaged by torture. That was his favorite thing. And some of the descriptions of that are really, I had to put the book down, and that doesn't happen to me often. I had to go away and put the book down for 2 weeks, having read about what he thought of as after dinner entertainment, you know. And it is exactly that problem, that predatory people, whether they be motivated, I think Hitler probably really did want something positive for this mythological animal, the German people,
yes.
You know, which meant anybody who spoke German, basically. I think he probably had a good intention. I think Thatcher probably had a good intention. They just got the wrong ideology and created mayhem. Stalin and Mao, on the other hand, I think, and possibly Lenin, were genuinely predatory people who wanted power and who wanted to bully people and hurt people. And how we get checks and balances into human society that say, yeah, that stop that, you know. And I think we have gone a long way. I was talking with a chap I hadn't met before last night, and he called himself cynical. He said he was cynical, and that's a dangerous place to go, because cynical means irrational. It means I color everything dark no matter what. Skeptical, I'm willing to accept, you know, that we question everything. But I don't feel cynical. I feel that if you look at the way society was in the 19th century and you look at the way it is now, that there are, you know, we do have an age of sexual consent, for example. It was 12 initially among the Victorians. The French don't, I'm told, but you know,
the French are confusing.
The French are very confusing.
They're constantly confusing. You know, it's like the age of consent laws. You know, you look at the people who are against it. It's like that's like the list of French academia for the last 100 years. And the arguments they had were very strange. And this is coming from
our rights.
And this is someone who quite likes quite a lot of French thought. And even then, I'm a bit like, okay, come on, guys, this is.
That, though, you know, when you get to Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, it is worth pointing out they were both collaborators with the Nazis and then supporters of Stalin. You know, so their arguments do kind of fall apart.
Oh yeah, Sartre's sort of resistance, you know, is laughable. I mean, you know, Camus is as well. It's like, oh, we wrote a book that was against the Nazis. You just have to read very carefully between the lines. It's like, and then
it was actually an anti-Nazi thing, and when they first play on. That put me off Sartre completely. I read it when I was about 15 and went,
yeah. I mean, because I quite like parts of Camus. And
absolutely. Camus' thinking about it and the idea of absurdism, I think, is important. But I think Spike Milligan and Peter Sellers got a better view of what it really is. It's falling in the water. You know, that Camus, when you start getting, I don't know, posing about absurdism, that's absurd to me.
Yeah, well, it's like surreal upon surreal, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, like, but Sartre, Nausea, I mean, frankly, it's a terrible book. It's like, I think it's like a 200-page, but it's just a 200-page whine.
Terrible.
You know, and how could anyone ever enjoy that? I'm not quite sure.
Well, I think endure is the thing with existentialism, not enjoy, isn't it? You know.
Yeah. And
we've got to put up with this somehow.
Yeah, and it's not like you know, I'm completely at odds with that in some ways. But it's just specifically that book of Sartre, especially for me, it's just sort of a cornerstone of something that's been held up literally that just isn't very, very good writing wise as well. It's ugly and it's badly structured.
I agree.
But not a fan of that book. Yeah.
No, and it, I mean, that leads us to a whole other topic, which we will discuss perhaps the next time we talk, which is about culture and aesthetics. And you know, I know that that's something that you're very interested in.
Yeah.
And that, like me, you've developed your own view of what, you know, it's not Derrida or any sort of fixed system of aesthetics.
No.
It's trying to work out what it is that I think that culture is the most significant thing. I think that we it's the water in which we swim that we don't, the air we breathe, we don't even notice it. It conditions our thinking. I was talking to a friend the other day about Shusaku Endo, and was quite surprised that I've only read The Silence, and I read it when I was about 20. He named 2 other Endo books and got all sorts of stuff going. So I was humiliated and demeaned on camera yet again. But the thing about that, when I read The Silence, having, engaged myself with the aesthetic culture of Japan, ukiyo-e, Hiroshige and Hokusai, these Utamaro, these incredible artists. And, having read a certain amount of Zen Buddhism, though the Zen that's exported to the West is very much Rinzai, it's very much Zen, you don't get the Soto.
Fake.
Yeah, and the thing is that Zen is a horrible, horrible cult. And Daisetsu Suzuki, who's principally responsible for bringing Zen to the West through Alan Watts, in fact, did admit that he'd been involved with soldier Zen and using these techniques to bring about fanaticism and the most horrific attitude since Genghis Khan, really, and among any set of troops.
I mean, Japan's cultural identity is probably something I'm deeply fascinated with. You read lots of Japanese texts. All Japanese authors, I'd say, the last 1900s onwards, all deal with these sort of tensions between Japan as a culture, an old culture, and new Western values. And I think it's not unfair to say that all of Japan's major problems, social problems, all come from a very twisted mutation between old school Asian Japanese values, and then you mix that with essentially what is corporate capitalism, which is what America brought over to them.
Cynical capitalism, yeah.
And then what you get produced at the end is essentially just all the social problems. So that's like the rape culture in Japan, overwork, death by overwork, the educational culture, all those sort of things. Though the other interesting thing about Japanese culture, just on a quick point, and also returns us to the point thing we're talking about in culture, as I agree, because culture is the most important thing.
Yeah.
It's like I was saying about democracy earlier. It doesn't happen at the vote because, in a sense, democracy is culture. I think we always fair to say.
It is. Of course it is. It's the belief, any kind of belief in equality. That's a cultural value.
Yeah.
And you can come back to Ibsen, who in An Enemy of the People, he has a character say, so democracy is the rule of majority. And the guy says, yes. He said, well, tell me, who makes up the majority, the wise or the fools? And I'm afraid that does put us into a difficult situation where we have populist democracy, that horrible things will happen. What I was going to say about Endo is that I was surprised, as somebody who knew a little bit about Japanese culture, that this Japanese Christian didn't have the Christian values that are normal in British culture. His values were very much Japanese, and there were things, I can't remember any example of it, but there were things that struck me as a very odd way of looking at the world because they were not the way I'd been brought up with. And that becomes very important, that to mature, you have to understand that other people have other cultures and that's fine. As long as those other cultures are not sadistic.
Yeah. And very few are, to be honest, at the base.
They go that way. And that's what we have to look to, that, as you know, I'm very big on the work of Eric Fromm. And I think that, and there are all sorts of things that need to be put right in it because it belongs to its time. And there are errors of science that need to be corrected. We do know more now than was known then about many things. But nonetheless, his fundamental idea is that to grow up, to become mature, means to understand that if we do things that are antisocial, it will harm us. Ultimately, it will harm us. And so if we are to create a civilization and a society, and it's never been done, well, maybe the Indus Valley Society, they seem to live for 700 years without warfare, which is pretty good. Or the Kogi in Colombia, or the Huichol in Mexico, or the Baaka Pygmy in the Congo, or the San. There are very small, the Sami as well. There are very small groups of people that do seem to have survived without warfare as a primary driver. But our culture is not one of those. We live, hopefully at a period where it can be understood that anything that we do against other human beings is done to ourselves, is done to the greater body, and the maturity comes. I'm not sure about the word love. That we should love everyone. I'm not up for that.
It's 60s, yeah.
I don't think we should harm other people, and I think that restraint should be there.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the other thing for me would be, I think the most concerning force that's been giving birth to lots of these problems, some of new threats, is also the overall just commodification of everything.
Yes.
It's reminding me, this incredible Marx quote actually that I read a few weeks ago. That I was like, he saw it coming from a mile away.
Yes, he did.
Because this is always my sort of my tension with the Marxists actually, which is that I like lots of the way they observe the world, or they analyze the way that things are. I'm like, this is very interesting. This is quite accurate. And then when they propose solutions, I'm like, you've completely lost it. What are you doing? It's like Lenin writing about imperialism, the high force capitalism. I'm like, okay, I can sit well with most of this stuff. And then he writes about vanguardism, and I'm like, this is an awful idea. This is a terrible, terrible idea for the reasons that the Soviet Union went wrong, basically. And if you read well-informed and lucid Marxists, I'd argue, even before Stalin took power, they were critiquing the USSR already. I don't know if you know Simone Weil.
Yes, from a slight distance now, but yes. Yeah,
so because from some of her writing around the pre-World War II, she was, she saw straight through Soviet bureaucracy, arguing that
Rosa Luxemburg, of course, right at the very beginning.
Yeah, and so
there should be women who've actually seen that these men are going to do this dreadful thing.
Well, it's the interesting this feminist socialist sort of route as well, which I think we're sorely lacking. It turns out that if you don't have a sort of strong economic critique in some form, weirdly, it fuels lots of the right in the long term, because if you look at lots of the strains that led to the modern, online at least, right-wing movements, not right-wing as in sort of old school One Nation Tories, but right-wing as in sort of Richard Spencer types, they all sort of start with anti-feminism as their first thing. And it's, to be honest, it's because lots of the feminist critiques that are presented by people without the economic critiques tend to fail. Right? It's like the wage gap criticism really does tend to fail unless you have an argument beyond that. Yeah. Because the wage gap is simply that if you take all average earnings per hour and then you divide them, you'll get different numbers. The question then, why do we get different numbers, is an interesting one.
Yeah. And statistically, you have to look at the mean, the mode, and the median, not just the mean.
And then you get some like strange person saying something like, "Well, we should introduce a tax for men or something." It's like, no, this isn't the right solution. And if you read,
make men have babies.
Yeah, it's just, it's like, well, surely more generous and pay maternity leave. But even that has problems, obviously, because you're still away from work for 2 years or something, so you still don't have the time to actually progress your career, so you lose 2 years, and your working life actually isn't it hopefully shouldn't be 50 years long, more the point, though we're sort of reaching those limits now, as we put retirement age backwards and backwards and backwards. It's incredible how we managed to keep the economic disparity, bring women into the workforce in all areas of the workforce, and yet still somehow, instead of families getting doubly rich by both the father and the mother working, instead they're sort of earning relatively of the wealth pie, half, and they're working for longer hours. Yep. And they're taking their jobs homes with them. It's really done a number on us.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That we've come to a very strange position socially, but I think probably you have to go to a lecture.
I You're right about that. Thank you for reminding me.
This has been great. This has been so much fun. So let's end off here. We'll have a quick word before you rush off to your lecture.
Yeah, sure.
I'm Jon Atack.
And I'm Rio Hirotaka.
And please stick some stuff in the comments if there's something you'd like us to talk about. And it's been a tremendous pleasure, Rio, as ever.
Yeah, it's a tremendous pleasure to talk to you as always. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Hi, Jon here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
Maybe you smell.